those of you who like coffee, my last sermon series was like drinking a shot of espresso. It was meant to serve you as an inspirational boost. The sermon series I am beginning tonight is more like drinking regular coffee. This series is more informational than it is inspirational. You could just say that I'm going to give it to you straight. So on that note, let me begin. I want to welcome you to part one of a part 4 sermon series that I've entitled, What Matters? And tonight's sermon title is Leadership Matters. And the passage that we will be studying is Exodus 32. So go ahead and turn to Exodus 32 as I begin. In a couple of days, America will vote on who her leader will be for the next 4 years. Some have said, and I would agree, that the upcoming election is the most important election in our nation's history. I know you hear that come every election year, so maybe it would help you more if I said that I think the results of this year's election will have a deeper impact on our nation than the previous election's results. That's any election in history results. I do not see a need to use my time tonight to draw out the monumental differences between President-elect candidates Donald Trump and Joe Biden. If you've watched any television or listened to any radio recently, you should be familiar with the different ideologies that these men stand for. My point tonight is simply to say that leadership matters. I think we see this principle in action very clearly in our passage tonight that we're studying in Exodus 32. What we're going to see is a deep contrast between the leadership styles of two men, in this case, Moses and Aaron. So follow along with me as I begin in verse 1, where it says, When the people saw that Moses delayed in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said to him, Come, make gods for us, for who will go before us, because this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. All right, let me stop there and just say that and tell you what I see is happening, what's going on in this passage. Israel's leader, Moses, had a very important trip to make. And the people knew that Moses had to go up to Mount Sinai to visit with God. Remember, it had not been long before the people themselves were standing at the foot of the mountain, hearing from God themselves, and they were trembling before him. The people knew that Moses and Aaron held a special leadership place among Israel because the Lord had told Moses that only he and Aaron could come up the mountainside. Not even the priests were allowed to come up. However, Moses He had a higher leadership privilege than Aaron, so he was allowed to go higher up the mountain. Now let me stop here and say, and just bring this home and apply it to you in your lives. Has your boss ever told you that he'd be gone for a few days? Or maybe you remember when you were a child and one of your parents said they had to go out of town on a business trip. You know, it doesn't take long after they leave for you to figure out that you can begin to loosen up, right? You can begin to goof off some and get away with some things that you normally wouldn't get away with if these authority figures were around. It's kind of like having a substitute teacher. Have you ever heard the expression, when the cat's away, the mouse will play? The nation of Israel was no different. It seems they had spiritual amnesia, forgetting they even had a spiritual leader. In this case, I'm going to call him their president. There was a delay in Moses coming down from the mountain. So Israel gathers around the vice president, second in command, and they elect Aaron to be their new leader. It was as if Aaron and the people thought that Moses was never coming back down. And the people, now having received Aaron's permission, they figured they could do whatever they wanted to do. And so in verse 2 it says, Aaron replied to them, take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings that were on their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, fashioned it with an engraving tool, and made it into an image of a calf. Then they said, "Israel, these are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of it and made an announcement. "There will be a festival to the Lord tomorrow." Early the next morning they arose, offered burnt offerings, and presented fellowship offerings. The people sat down to eat and drink and got up to party. You see them worshiping all that gold they took off from their ears and pretending that was the Lord. It doesn't take a rocket science to see what is happening here. The boss man goes on a trip, mom and dad leave the house, and what happens? Whoever's left alone throws a party. And this is exactly why leadership matters. This is why we need leaders. Leaders are in place to help keep you accountable to what God wants you to do. But in this case, Aaron isn't being the type of leader that he's been called to be. Rather than saying no to a party, he becomes the party's ringleader. He says, "Bring your earrings, your jewelry, bring it to me. I'll make a golden calf out of it, and we'll all worship the Lord tomorrow by honoring this calf." Do you see how Aaron has mixed religions by saying that this was a festival for the Lord? Verse 7 says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, 'Go down at once, for your people you brought up from the land of Egypt have acted corruptly. They have quickly turned from the way I commanded them. They have made for themselves an image of a calf. They have bowed down to it, sacrificed to it, and said, Israel, these are your gods who brought you up out of the land from Egypt.' The Lord also said to Moses, 'I've seen this people. They are indeed a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger can burn against them and I can destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation.'" So, again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that the Lord is ticked here. You can't tell me there aren't times where God does not get angry. We see it in this count. Moses says in Deuteronomy 9:19-20 that the Lord was angry enough to destroy Aaron and the people. But he didn't, because Moses interceded on their behalf. Praise God. Prayer is important, isn't it? Do you know someone personally the Lord might be angry at? Pray for them. Do you think the Lord may be angry at America? Pray for her. Verse 11 says, "But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. 'Lord, why does your anger burn against your people you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a strong hand? Why should the Egyptians say, he brought them out with an evil intent to kill them in the mountains and eliminate them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger and relent concerning the disaster planned for your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. You swore to them by yourself and declared, I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky, and will give your offspring all this land that I have promised, and they will inherit it forever.' Verse 14, so the Lord relented concerning the disaster he had said he would bring on his people." As you can see here, the Lord answered Moses' prayer, and the people of God, the Israelites, those Moses were leading, they were spared from God's wrath. It might help you as you pray your prayers to notice that Moses made his prayer more about the Lord and the Lord's great name than he made his prayer about the people. The people deserve to die, but the Lord doesn't always give his people what they deserve. He gives them grace. He gives them mercy. And they need to understand the grace He gives them is more about His great name than it is theirs. Verse 15 says, "Then Moses turned and went down the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands. They were inscribed on both sides, inscribed front and back. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was God's writing engraved on the tablets." So we see that Aaron had been engraving a golden calf. God at the same time had been doing His own engraving. Verse 17 says, "When Joshua heard the sound of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, 'There is a sound of war in the camp.' But Moses replied, 'It's not the sound of a victory cry and not the sound of a cry of defeat. I hear the sound of singing.' As he approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses became enraged and threw the tablets out of his hand, smashing them at the base of the mountain. He took the calf they had made, burned it up, and ground it to powder. He scattered the powder over the surface of the water and forced the Israelites to drink the water." So here we have it. The nation's leader now is ticked. Moses is back. He already had caught wind of what was happening before he ever made it down the mountain. Not only had Moses been up on the mountain 40 days without eating food or eating bread, or drinking water, he had done all this for the people. That's why he had left. He had sacrificed himself greatly for a long period of time, only to come down and see that the people couldn't restrain themselves even for a short period of time. No wonder Moses was chosen by God to be their leader. We like to question our leaders. Sometimes we like to complain about them or even to them. But we often forget there's a reason that God has put them in the place that He has. However, that doesn't mean our leaders are always perfect. Look at the next verse, verse 21. "Then Moses asked Aaron, 'What did these people do to you that you have led them into such a grave sin?' 'Don't be enraged, my lord,' Aaron replied. 'You yourself know that the people are intent on evil. They said to me, "Make gods for us who will go before us, because this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him." So I said to them, "Whoever has gold, take it off." And they gave it to me. When I threw it into fire, out came this calf." Now, I don't know about you, but the answer that Aaron gives to the leader, Moses, sounds like a bunch of baloney. Because Aaron first blames the people, and then he comes up with this wild story to explain away his own misgivings. This is no different than how Adam and Eve reacted to God in the garden when they first sinned. Verse 25 continues, "Moses saw that the people were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control, making them a laughingstock to their enemies. And Moses stood at the camp's entrance and said, 'Whoever is for the Lord, come to me.' And all the Levites gathered around him. He told them, 'This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Every man fasten his sword to his side, go back and forth through the camp from entrance to entrance, and each of you kill his brother, his friend, and his neighbor.' The Levites did as Moses commanded, and about 3,000 men fell dead that day among the people. Afterward, Moses said, 'Today you have been dedicated to the Lord, since each man went against his son and his brother. Therefore you have brought a blessing on yourselves today.'" Look back in verse 25. The first thing that we notice is that when God's people blatantly sin or go against God, it makes them look like fools. Their enemies sit back and they laugh at them, and rightfully so. But notice what Moses does next. Moses isn't playing games when it comes to God's house. Instead, Moses is cleaning house. In stark contrast to what we see in the New Testament account of the Acts 2 Pentecost sermon by Peter, where 3,000 people get saved, in this Old Testament account we see 3,000 of God's people getting slaughtered. And not only slaughtered, but slaughtered by the priests for disobeying God. You might wonder to yourself, is this the same God? But it is. Whereas God's law is a dominant theme in the Old Testament, in this account, God's grace is a dominant theme in the New Testament, in the account where Peter is preaching his sermon. The God of love is the same God of wrath. In verse 29, we even see family going against their own family. And this reminds me of words that Jesus used in the New Testament that explain to us how following Him can create division even in our own families. Some things never change, right? Not everyone in your family knows the Lord, and some in your family will persecute you because you do know the Lord. But let's continue on with today's passage and looking at verse 30, which says, "The following day, Moses said to the people, 'You have committed a grave sin. Now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I will be able to atone for your sin.' So Moses returned to the Lord and said, 'Oh, these people have committed a grave sin. They have made a god of gold for themselves. Now if you would only forgive their sin, but if not, please erase me from the book you have written.' The Lord replied to Moses, 'Whoever has sinned against me, I will erase from my book. Now go, lead the people to the place I told you about. My angel will go before you. But on the day I settle accounts, I will hold them accountable for their sin.' And the Lord inflicted a plague on the people for what they did with the calf Aaron had made." In verse 30, we see that there are no guarantees. Though Aaron is a high priest, Moses seems to function more like the high priest in this passage. Moses says to God, "Perhaps I will be able to atone for your sin." Or that's what he said to the people, perhaps. But perhaps doesn't sound too reassuring. So Moses takes an extra step. Moses does what a good leader should do. He puts his own life on the line, and he tells God that if God won't forgive his people's sins, then wipe his name out from the book. This has to be why Numbers 12:3 tells us that Moses was more humble than anyone on the face of the earth. God's reply to Moses is that each person is responsible for their own sin, and that he will judge who makes it in the good book and who doesn't. It's pretty heavy, isn't it? I can't help but think of the accounts in Revelation where our lives will be judged by whether our names are in the Lamb's book of life or whether they are not. Our sin will be determined by what we did or didn't do with God's Son, Jesus Christ. Did we believe or not believe in Him? However, there still exists some degree of suffering in this life from the sins that we commit on earth, because the passage ends with God punishing His people with a plague for their sin. I say all that tonight to say this: leadership matters. I don't know about you, but I would rather have Moses as my leader than I would Aaron. If you gave me a ballot with these two men on the ballot, I know who I'd vote for. One leader is about his nation following God. The other leader is about his nation throwing a party. The question I have for you is, when wartime comes, which leader would you want to have in charge? God doesn't give up on his leaders. Aaron learned from his mistakes, and he went on to do great things for God. But when it comes to this week's national election, you can only vote for one candidate. I ask you, I implore you, pray for this nation, pray for its people, but also pray that God would show you which candidate is the best candidate to lead this nation forward.